In Chapter 8, we're going to combine what happens in Chapters 6 and 7 to look to see what happens to surplus when there's a tax. All right, so the first thing, let's look at Chapter 7, calculating consumer surplus. So this triangle right here, which is below the price and below the demand curve, and above the price, is consumer surplus. This triangle right here, below the price and above the supply curve, is producer surplus. And total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. All right, so with that in mind, let's look at the example of what happens when a tax is imposed. So remember, a tax puts a wedge between the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller receives, and it reduces the quantity. So as a result now, let's identify the different parts of this graph. Well, the first thing to note is that this distance here is the size of the tax, right? That's the tax dollars. And so if I look to see how much each item was taxed multiplied by the quantity, this rectangle there becomes tax revenue. Now the next area we can look at is below the demand curve, but above the price the consumer pays. This area here is consumer surplus. The next area we can identify is below the price the seller receives and above the supply curve. This here is producer surplus. And so that's, when we look at a tax, what we notice is before consumer surplus was this big triangle, was this triangle right here, but that's decreased to just the green triangle. So a tax decreases consumer surplus. Before, producer surplus was this triangle. It is no more. It is now just this lower green triangle. So a tax also decreases producer surplus. What it does generate is this rectangle here, and it does generate tax revenue. But now we're left with one more area. We're left with this area right here. Well, this is an interesting area because before the tax, all these consumers here were willing to purchase the good at a price at or above equilibrium price. And all these producers here were willing to produce the good at or below equilibrium price. And so that was economic activity that was happening, but now it's not happening anymore. And so we call this dead weight loss. So that is not economic activity that's happening anymore. So therefore, as a result of the tax, it creates a dead weight loss. And so now when we look at total surplus with a tax is less than total surplus without a tax. And so we are not efficient. And the book goes through and identifies each of these triangles or areas to identify what's happening. So they call this area A, which is consumer surplus with a tax. They call this area B, which is the tax revenue that's coming from an increase in price to consumers. They call this area C. It's the deadweight loss that's coming as a result of the increased price to consumers. This is D. So this is the decrease, or this is the tax revenue that's caused by a decrease in the price to producers. E is the deadweight loss as a result of producers not producing anymore. And F is the producer surplus as a result of the tax. And so we can identify different areas here to say that without a tax, consumer surplus is A plus B plus C. And producer surplus is D plus E plus F. But once we get a tax, so with a tax, consumer surplus is now just A, producer surplus is F. When we think of tax revenue, That is B plus D. And when we think of dead weight loss, is C plus E. So we can use this as a framework to look to identify what happens to surplus when a tax is instituted.